Hello, and welcome to Author a la carte for September 19th, 2019. To hear the interview better, in the menu in the upper right hand corner, you can slide music and sounds off, and then you should only be able to hear the voices nearby. Between my guest and I, you can see copies of our authors' books. If you click on them, they will lead you to they will open your browser and take you to their book page where you can browse or buy a copy. Today, instead of the tip jar, here on the bar, we have bowls, two raffle bowls, and you can just getting my note cards open, and you can buy a ticket to to our raffle, where you can actually win a Kindle version of the author's book, if you like. Let's see, there's something I'm missing and I don't know what it is. Oh, no, not. All right. Patricia Averbach. Do I have that right? Averbach?
Yep, Averbach is good.
Okay. A Cleveland native, is the former director of the Chautauqua Writers Center in Chautauqua, New York. Her first work of fiction, Painting Bridges, received the London based Lumen Camden Prize in 2013.
No, no, it did not.
That's very strange then.
I'm sorry. No, it was a finalist for a Chanticleer Chaucer Award, but the Lumen Camden Prize was won by my poetry chapbook called Missing Persons.
All right, moving right along. Previous work includes a memoir about her very early career as Anzia Yezierka's 16-year-old literary assistant and an article about the Jewish community in a virtual world called Second Life. She has just completed a second novel, New Moon Rising, the contemporary story of a woman who loses her house but finds her home. Welcome, Patricia, to Author a la carte.
Thank you. And just in the interest of getting our facts straight, that second novel was called New Moon Rising, and in fact, the unpublished manuscript won a couple awards under, or at least was a semifinalist for a couple awards under that title, but it's going to be published as Resurrecting Rain early next year, so the title changed. And I'm sorry, I don't think I made the change on the card I gave you, so that was my bad.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Moving right along. Tell us where you're from and when you first knew that you wanted to write.
Oh, I am one of those people who always knew they wanted to write. I remember being in sixth grade, so I must have been 11 or 12 years old. And there was, at the end of sixth grade, we all signed each other's autograph books, and we had to include what we wanted to be when we grew up. And I wanted to be a poetess, not a poet, a poetess. I guess that was something like being an actress or a waitress back in the pre-feminist days.
Wonderful. And how do you feel that the era you grew up in shaped you as a writer?
Um, Well, there were virtually no creative writing programs back in my day. The University of Iowa and a couple other universities had writing programs, but they were the exception. If you studied English back then, you studied the classics and literary criticism, which kind of turned me off. And I think I, I lost my direction. I think if I were starting out today, my journey toward writing would have been much more direct and without as many detours because I would have had more support from a writing community that didn't exist at that time.
I understand. And not asking about publishing, but how many books in total have you written?
Well, I've completed two novels. One is The Painting Bridges, uh, and the second, Resurrecting Rain, will be published early next year. I'm better than halfway through my third novel, which is called Duplicity. I also wrote a poetry book that won an award in the UK. I'm an American, but I entered an international competition based in London. And that chapbook was listed as one of the best small collections of the year by the Times of London Literary Supplement. So that was a good year for me.
Fantastic. And how long have you been excuse me? How long have you been working on painting bridges?
Well, it took me about 2 years to complete the novel, maybe even a little more. Um, with, but it was, I did not work as diligently as I might have. There were breaks during those 2 years.
Understandably, understandably. And what first inspired the story of painting bridges for you?
Well, it began as a short story about a depressed and grieving young woman. Then a friend who I met in Second Life, Adele Ward, encouraged me to turn it into a novel. And I remember telling her, no, I only write poetry and short things. I can't do a novel. Uh, and I really didn't have a concept for a full length book, but I started writing anyway. And before long, the character of the deaf child wandered into the story, and the plot elements began to fall into place around her. I should say that I trained as a speech pathologist and worked in a deaf nursery briefly back in the 70s. So I had some experience with deaf children and kind of a deep emotional attachment to those deaf children.
That's very sweet. And how would you say that the Second Life community has helped you become a better writer?
I owe thanks for whatever success I've had as a writer to the Chautauqua Institution in Western New York State and to Second Life. I've been part of a Second Life writers group for many years, and that small group has kept me focused and moving forward. I'm very indebted to them for their advice, motivation, and support. And I'd also like to say that Milkwood has been a wonderful support as well. I've enjoyed the NaNoWriMo events and the dashes and the company of other writers on this sim.
That's absolutely wonderful. And and now we'd love to hear you read a portion of your book for us.
Thank you. This is not the very, very beginning of the book, but it's near the beginning. Um, the central character is Sam, and she is a young widow. She's only 26, but she's already lost a husband and a child. It's 1976, and in her grief, she's holed herself up in the old farmhouse that she and her husband had been renovating when their child was born. But now she just has locked herself into the house and will go nowhere and see no one except her mother-in-law, Sheila, who comes and takes her out shopping. And since her husband and child were killed in a car accident, she also will not drive. And it's spring of 1973, and of 1976, and it's been raining. It's been an unrelenting rain. A week later, the weather hadn't changed. The fields behind the house, fragile in the spring, were swollen by melted snow and heavy rains. Spongy earth sank under Sam's feet, so that a trail of muddy footprints sprouted behind her as she cut through the grass and clover toward the woods. She's heading toward the family cemetery at the back of her property. She should have put on boots. Her Nikes would be ruined. Her socks were already damp, and she hadn't even reached the pond and its surrounding marsh. In a normal state of mind, she would have returned to the house, put on dry socks, thick-soled rubber shoes, a warmer coat. But she was in no mood for turning back. She trudged forward, clutching a pot of daffodils from Bell's grocery. Sheila had bought them for Sam as a gift, but Sam thought, too bright, too loud, too yellow for the house. An old logging road ran through the forest, which began just beyond the fields. This had been a working farm. The fields had sprouted soybeans, corn, timothy, and rye. Sam had inherited the stories with the house. Black and white Herefords had grazed in the adjoining pasture. The orchard had produced heavy crops of apples, northern spy, and golden russet. Sheila claimed to remember teams of oxen, then big Peterbilts hauling timber from the woods. Of course, that had all been history by the time that Ben was born. Now there wasn't much but mud and weeds, thorny brambles, and wild ramps that smelled like onions. The blade of an ancient plow rusted beside an outcropping of glacial rock just beyond the field where it had sat for untold years. It had all looked so different through Ben's eyes. When she had stood in this very place beside her husband, she'd only seen the future. Once the house was finished, they were going to hire a backhoe to dredge the pond, clear the brush and cattails. She had looked beyond the algae-clogged surface of the water, the overgrown weeds, the decaying stumps, and seen a grassy slope, a willow tree, and children splashing in a clear pool. Fungus had destroyed the northern spy trees, but the golden russets were still strong. She and Ben planned to bring them back, and they were going to rebuild the barn and buy a couple goats and maybe a pony for June when she was older. Her eyes followed the property line to the north where she'd planted a hedge of blueberries last September. They weren't there anymore. Deer had eaten the young bushes to the ground. Slogging forward, she continued into the woods, past the pond and across the ravine, ignoring the water sloshing in her shoes and the mud weighing down the bottom of her jeans. Where the road forked, she headed north until the trees came to an abrupt end, and she stepped into a clearing marked by thin gray stones etched with the names of Crawfords dating back 100 years. In fact, most of the deceased had been laid to rest before the Second World War, since the more recent dead generally chose to be buried at South Shore Cemetery, with its views of Lake Erie to the north and endless rows of Concord grapevines to the east. But even so, there were 2 new graves. Sam took a small trowel from her jacket pocket and began digging in the soft mud. Tipping the flowers from their pots and gently dividing the bulbs, she planted a few on each mound. Patting the earth smooth, she sat back on her heels, satisfied that the flowers looked lovely beneath the simple headstones. The smaller one read, June Crawford, June 1st, 1973, October 15th, 1974. Engraved on the larger headstone just beside it, Benjamin Lee Crawford, January 12th, 1951, October 15th, 1974. Sam had insisted they be buried here in the old family plot. South Shore Cemetery was miles away, too far from home, too far from her. She wiped off the trowel, stuck it in her pocket, and turned back the way she'd come. Just at the point where the path disappeared into the woods, Sam turned for one last look, then blinked in disbelief. A little girl was standing on her baby's grave, picking the newly planted daffodils. For the briefest moment, Sam had the irrational thought that her daughter had somehow risen from the dead to accept her mother's gift. But no, this child was old enough to be at school, and she was wearing a dirty pink parka that was a size too small. "Hey," Sam shouted, "what do you think you're doing?" The child tore the last daffodil from the ground and added it to her bouquet. Sam ran toward the child. "Hey, look at me. Turn around and look at me. Don't you know better than to steal flowers from a grave?" Sam was standing right behind the child, who continued to ignore her. Exasperated, she grabbed the girl's arm and whirled her around so that they faced each other. A look of abject terror crossed the child's face. She let out a wild, bestial grunt and struggled to get free. Sam recoiled as if she'd seen a ghost. The child's almond eyes, her thick brows, the contours of her face were exactly like her daughter's. "June?" she said softly, illogically, not a question but a prayer. Sam didn't want to frighten her, but she held tight. "It's okay, please, I'm not mad. Just tell me your name. Do you live around here?" The little girl began kicking and emitting strange yipping sounds. Sam let go and the child fled into the forest, still holding tight to the flowers. Why was her heart pounding and her hands shaking so badly that she had to cross her arms and hug herself to keep them still? "They're just stupid flowers," Sam kept repeating to herself. "I can plant some more tomorrow." Her eyes followed her feet all the way back through the woods, never glancing to the right or left. I must be going mad imagining the child looked so much like June. As she cut across the lawn toward the house, she looked up to find a note taped to her side door. Damn! She'd promised Sheila she'd drive with her to Erie for lunch and shopping, and now she'd probably stood her up. And I think I will stop there.
Well, that was fantastic.
Why, thank you.
Let's see. Throw on my handy dandy little tracker.
I think I should make way for your next guest.
Actually, no. Next, we have a Q&A session from our audience who has been listening so patiently. So if anybody has... No, please sit down. If anybody has a question for our illustrious author, Kiki, who has wandered off.
Shiloh, I think you're up.
I'm sorry, my mic was not on. Kiki, if you could sit.
Oh, I'll sit.
I'm so sorry. We next have a Q&A session from our audience. If anyone would like to ask Kiki questions about her writing or her reading that she just gave us, or have any comments about her reading today, please either hit C for comment or Q for question. So I will give you a minute or so to toss in your C's and Q's. Sorry, I was like joyfully going on and on with my mic off, just as I predicted I would.
And I forgot that there was a Q&A after the meeting, so we're even.
You know, I think I forgot to. Did I forget to mention it on the note card? I think I did.
You probably mentioned it. I'm famous for forgetting things.
So am I, especially when I'm decaffeinated. So, with no further ado, we have one comment from Rain Bodit. Rain, go ahead. And Rain says, "Sorry I'm late. What kind of story is it?" And she was really enjoying it.
It is what I have learned to call upmarket women's fiction, meaning it's women's fiction with literary pretensions. And also, much to my surprise, because it takes place in 1976, it is also considered somewhat historical, which is why it was a finalist for the Chanticleer Chaucer Award, which is awarded for historical fiction. The book actually does address historical issues in deaf education, although it's not what the book is about. But just as we learn more about the characters and what's happening during that time, there is a battle between the little deaf girl's mother, who wants the child to learn sign language, and her father, who wants her to learn oral speech. And so that becomes part of the drama.
I have to throw in there that I was in 1976. I was 2 and 3 years old, so to hear that it's a historical kind of makes me feel my age a little tiny bit.
Well, how do you think I feel?
Very wise and learned.
Yes.
Yes. Do we have any more questions or comments for Kiki Underwood, aka Patricia? Excuse me, Patricia Averbach.
Yes.
You have a question about yourself? Oh, she misunderstood. All right. Well, thank you very much. If we could get a huge applause for our guest.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to read.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
And I hope we do this again
Okay.
when your next book comes out.
I hope I have the opportunity.
So, Afa, if you could please come join me at the chair. And I'll let you get comfortable with your preferred pose.
Okay, the first thing I should do is test voice and make sure that everyone is hearing me okay.
I'm hearing you loud and clear and lovely.
Thank you. All right, I am ready when you are.
Wonderful. Afa is an instructional designer who worked in the private sector and higher education and enjoyed it. She retired quite early for health reasons and currently has an astrology practice as well as being active in SL. Afa, tell us about where you're from and when you first knew that you wanted to write.
I grew up outside Chicago, so I'm a Midwesterner, and in fact have lived in the Midwest one part or another all my life. And like Patricia said, I can't remember a time when I didn't want to write.
All right. And how did the era you grew up in shape you as a writer?
I think that's an intriguing question, and I hadn't really considered it before I showed up on my prep sheet for this meeting. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I would say that at that time, culture was very experimental. There was a sense that anybody could do what they wanted, and creative expression was valued. So that certainly had an influence on, I think, me and many, with the idea that we could, in fact, engage in creative pursuits. But I'm not really a very modern person. I tend to look back to earlier times in history. So from, again, when I was very young, I've been fascinated with medieval history and the Napoleonic era and other times in history and fantasy worlds as well.
Bonus question. Would you say that you are one of those people who feels like you were born in the wrong time, or do you feel like you're born in the correct time?
Oh, definitely the wrong time.
What's your era?
Anything before the Industrial Revolution. I remain convinced that the Industrial Revolution was a really bad idea. So on the one hand, as a modern person and someone who has some chronic health issues, I appreciate many things about the modern era that I rely on. And yet, in terms of my personality and what I would most enjoy, I'd say early 1800s, sometime before that, maybe. I would be fascinated to be alive. If I could time travel, I would.
And is there, you might want to turn off your microphone while I'm speaking so that I don't echo through your computer. But would you say that there's a specific country in the 1800s that you would have loved to live in?
Well, my family background is Irish, and I love Ireland. But when I think of the early 1800s, I'm thinking of Jane Austen's England.
I think that's a popular choice. And how many books have you written?
This novel that we're talking about today is my first and only, so far at least. I've written lots of shorter things, academic articles, magazine articles, poetry, short stories, essays, but only this one novel, which I indie published on Amazon.
And my next question was, how many books have you published? So we have covered that. How long would you say did you work on Wild at Heart?
That's a tough question to answer because I think it depends on how you define working on a particular book. There have been several times in the past when I decided I was going to write a historical romance, which is what Wild at Heart is. And I still have a few substantial drafts from much earlier kinds of stories. What kickstarted me was learning about the new indie publishing movement and the ability for authors like myself to write something and dive in and take things directly to market. That inspired me to try again. And depending on how you want to count the timeline, I'd say 2 to 3 years, maybe a little more than 3 years on this particular one.
And bonus question for that, we don't necessarily hear, we haven't, at least in this show, we haven't really heard a lot about indie publishing from other authors. What would you say? Because sometimes the impression I get is that indie publishing is quite difficult uh, if you don't have the energy level for it per se. So what would you say has been like the biggest challenge in indie publishing, and yet the biggest payoff, other than selling well, to the biggest like psychological or spiritual or
Yeah. Um, Publishing has changed a lot since I was younger and first imagining myself as a published author sometime in my life. It's really difficult to get published these days, and so I am in awe and congratulatory to authors who find publishers. My interest was in genre work. This is a historical romance, and genre writing is one of the big ones that has moved in large part to include a substantial indie market. Part of what was discouraging me was the long cycle time of completing a novel and then shopping it around for an agent or directly to publishers and collecting all those rejection slips. And when I realized that there was an active, supportive indie community out there who was offering quite specific advice, genre specific and also general, it made a huge difference for me. I tend to be someone who likes to have a lot of creative control over what I'm doing. And I already had familiarity with creating and maintaining websites, and am fairly computer savvy. So those are the pieces that you need. You need to be able to have the ability to create the pieces that go into it, and then the ability to put it forward. That said, as part of this bonus question, I'll say that part of the plan involved then quickly writing several other novels, and for a variety of reasons that hasn't happened. So I have not made good on my plan so far to get things out in the indie community.
All right. I can't think of a good follow-up question for that. What first inspired the story of Wild at Heart?
Kind of a tricky question in the sense, as Patricia said as well, the nature of this story shifted, it changed substantially once I dove into it. I knew I wanted to set the story in 1816, which is the very end of the Napoleonic Wars. In my view, that is a really intriguing pivot time in history that I don't see explored in this particular way in novels. It's technically still the Regency period in England, and yet it's very different from the world of Austen. The war is over, the world has changed, and people are needing to find their way in a changed landscape. The other thing I knew was that I wanted a heroine who had led a fairly sheltered life and who was needing to encounter the world in a much wider, bigger way than she had ever imagined she would. Those were my two starting points, and from there, things evolved as the story took off and expanded.
I kind of have thought of a bonus question there, just based on some of my own experiences. Did you ever feel, when researching the book, did you ever feel like you got pushback from people helping you research, saying that your character would have too difficult a time accomplishing this or that as a female character?
No, I'd have to say that I did not have that experience. I am sure that people could make that argument if they wanted, but two things. One is this is a genre novel. You know, it's a historical romance. I would say in the overall world of historical romance, my characters are probably more realistic than many. And I would like to believe and hope that my research is pretty solid as well. Depending on where you are in that genre, people can play pretty fast and loose with actual history and take historical forms and sort of run with them in a very dramatic fashion. My book is more realistic while still portraying what happens in particular to the heroine when she finds herself in a world completely different from one she ever thought she would experience.
All right. And how has the Second Life community helped you become a better writer?
There are lots of ways. I think two ways that I would point to specifically are the opportunity to read my writing before an audience that proved to be very warm and appreciative and supportive. I read Wild at Heart in progress, not right at first, but later on to audiences. I've read poetry and short works and essays that I've written, and to have that opportunity and have people like it. I mean, just be warm and supportive as an audience. I don't know how else to say it. It's really been a wonderful thing. I read in Second Life before I ever read in real life. And I'm not entirely sure I would have had the confidence to do readings in real life if I had not first done it here. So that was one thing, just having people appreciate my work. And also, there are, as everyone here knows, a number of structured things offered in the writing community here. For example, mentioned in the earlier interview, Milkwood's programs and NaNoWriMo having a chapter here in Second Life. NaNoWriMo has been very helpful to me in getting stuff done. So that too is a way of having community that works well for me and is much appreciated.
Absolutely. I really have to agree with all of that. So next, I'd like to hear, a reading from Aoife, Clare Underwood, of Wild at Heart.
I'm going to read chapter 4, which is obviously fairly early in the story, but where you start to get a sense of how things might be developing. I published the book under the name Clare Alexander, which is actually my kids' names, but I thought it sounded great for a historical romance author. To give a brief intro so you know where we are, the heroine, but really the central focus of the book is Nora Nicholson. She is 26 and unmarried. Her brother is wanted to be a minister, got turned down for a living, decided he was going to be a missionary in Africa, and she must accompany him. They're on board the Dolphin, and she has met several key people there. She's getting to know an exotic Portuguese woman named Dolce. She has met Hugh Beaumont, formerly of the 95th Rifles. And she has begun doing some drawing work, some artwork for the ship's surgeon, John Sharples, who is a collector, a naturalist, as Hugh Beaumont is as well. This chapter is called A Change in the Weather. The Dolphin sailed south, and the weather softened. Hugh woke to shafts of early sun slicing through his window, glowing on the wooden floor and wall beyond. He'd slept especially well, his body registering the overnight change. He hurried to dress and climbed onto the deck where warm breezes tumbled through the rigging. The crew grinned at him, not minding the holystoning as much today. The sea was almost too bright to look at. He leaned his back against the railing and surveyed the deck, his gaze coming back to the main archway. When Miss Nicholson appeared there, he straightened. Her step was light as she walked toward him, her eyes bright. "Miss Nicholson," he said, "welcome to our first sunny day." "It's heavenly," she said. "I hadn't realized how accustomed I'd become to cold and damp." As if to bathe in the light, she untied her bonnet and removed it, wrapping the ribbons around her wrist. She lifted her face to the sun and laughed. He found himself enchanted. Her hair might be dismissed by some as plain brown, but the sun revealed a rich chestnut with deep auburn highlights. She'd arranged it in plain bands gathered at the back. Some shorter strands escaped, curling softly, hinting at waves. He watched those curls shift in the breeze, dark against the pale column of her neck. She gave him a quizzical look. He realized with a start she'd asked him a question. He smiled and turned his attention back to the conversation. Now the scene shifts. John Sharples had yet to see any finished sketches. Nora had asked him to wait until she completed something worthy. He was a patient man, but had been tempted more than once to peek over her shoulder. He resisted, deciding the breach of trust would be far worse than the satisfaction of seeing her work. Today, it seemed the day had come. He stepped into the main cabin to see 3 wings on a long table with one drawing next to each. Nora stood nearby. "Never tell me it's time," he said. "Your drawings are ready?" With a nervous laugh, she said, I realized I must stop or I will mar them. "They are ready, and you may see them." As he approached the table, she added, "Please, give me your honest opinion. If they're not good enough to be of use to you, I beg you will let me know." He nodded absently, already looking at the drawings. Watching her work so focused and intent, he'd been sure they would be adequate. But this was more than he'd anticipated. These were excellent likenesses with a delicate beauty well beyond mere representation. He picked up one, then another, enjoying them. These would grace any collection, would be worthy of a book. "Miss Nicholson, these are quite amazing. When you said you drew a little, I had no idea. These are works of art." She blushed, looking pleased as well as surprised. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "I don't want you to flatter me. This is your scientific work." No flattery," he said, "or at least none undeserved. Are you truly unaware of the quality of your work? These are very fine. I would be most happy, indeed honored, if you would be willing to create more such drawings. In fact, Miss Nicholson, you will make me look a better collector than I am." They spoke of the details, how she had faced various challenges, where he thought she had succeeded to admiration. Eager for her to continue, he offered to retrieve more specimens from his trunks that day and asked what drawing supplies she might need. The Dolphin would stop at Lisbon soon. He would be ordering medical supplies. It would be his pleasure to include whatever she required. As the day waned, the sun drifting low on the horizon, Nora heard a knock at her door. Thinking it was a cabin boy, she said absently, "Come." She looked up in surprise to see Dolce slide inside her room and close the door behind her. She stood to face her friend. "What has happened?" she asked. Dolce was as serious as Nora had ever seen her, her expression tight and angry. "I am in need of some few things and also your assistance and direction. There is one we must help. We need plain mild soap and some plain cloths." Hearing the urgency in her voice, Nora quickly found the things requested. "I have them here." Dolce put a hand to her chest and took in a breath. "I knew I was not mistaken in you. I knew I had come to the right door." She lowered her voice. "You have seen, perhaps, the woman of the cook, she who helps with meals." Nora pictured the heavy, silent woman who helped in the galley and nodded. That pig of a cook has the temper of a fiend. This time he has gone too far. The poor woman came to me bleeding and crying. I have sworn to help her. She shall not go back to him to be beaten. He can find someone else to do his work. Nora swallowed her questions and focused on the details. She is injured and in need of attention. Let's go to her. Dulce put a finger to her lips and led the way to her cabin. Not a word for now, please. Inside, Nora saw the cook's woman rocking back and forth in a wooden chair, holding her hands to her face and moaning. Dulce walked up to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Cynthia, she said, and a bit more loudly, Cynthia, we have come. See, I am here, as I said, with this kind lady. Let us see, love, what that pig has done to you. Cynthia stopped rocking and looked up at Dulce, one eye swelling and darkening. Blood trickled down the side of her face from a jagged cut. Nora had a basin as well as soap and cloths. She poured water from a pitcher, dipping the cloth and rubbing a little soap into it. She placed the basin on a nearby table and knelt beside Cynthia's chair. This may sting a little, she said, but we must get everything clean. Then we can see what else you need. It was shocking to see what the cook had done. In addition to the black eyes swelling shut, there was bruising and blood at Cynthia's mouth and red marks around her neck where it looked as though he had choked her. Once she realized the soap and water did not hurt, Cynthia seemed soothed, perhaps by the attention as much as the cleansing. Her gaze followed Dulce, who bustled about the room, finding and then pouring out some kind of cordial into 3 delicate crystal glasses. Dulce hummed under her breath, sometimes singing the words of what sounded like a lullaby. There, Cynthia, Nora said, dropping the wet cloth into the now bloody water. I think you'll do, but I might suggest consulting the ship's doctor. Cynthia's eyes flew wide and she broke into a torrent of Portuguese. Dulce came and soothed her, looking at Nora with reproach. Don't you see? She does not wish to see any of the ship's officers. She is convinced they will send her back to the pig, and she is afraid of him. She does not want any men at all. Oh, they would not, Nora said. He should be punished. I'm sure the doctor would say the same. Dulce tilted her head sideways, looking at Nora in a considering way. Perhaps it would be, as you say, my dear, and perhaps not. Men have a way of sticking together that is not always nice. However it may be, Cynthia will not go. I have promised her she may stay here. I do understand, but Cynthia's absence will be noted. Dulce tapped a finger on her chin. Yes, you're right. What to do, I know. You and I will go together to the captain's wife, the good Mrs. Longford, and explain she can arrange it all. Dulce looked ready to leave right then, heading for the door. A moment, Signora, Nora called. I would need to change my dress, and perhaps Cynthia should lie down, and it's likely Mrs. Longford has retired for the night. Yes, my most sensible Miss Nicholson, you are right once more. I will arrange things here. You go to your rest. Tomorrow morning the pig will fix breakfast without Cynthia, and we will talk with the good Mrs. Longford. But first, we toast our success to the strength of women and good fortune. Dulce brought the crystal glasses on a small lacquered tray. She insisted Cynthia accept the glass, then handed one to Nora, who turned it, admiring how the candlelight glinted in the amber liquid. She'd seen cut crystal in the squire's fine cabinets, but never held one. What is it? She asked. A special cordial from the countryside where I grew up, made from oranges. Try it. It is lovely and will calm us and help us sleep. Nora took a sip and realized this was no herbal infusion, but a strong liqueur. No wonder Dulce had brought them small glasses. She drank, enjoying the warmth and the scent and taste of oranges. Edward would be appalled. He need not know, she thought, and surprised herself at how unperturbed she was at the idea. She left the cabin as Dulce arranged a place for Cynthia on a low truckle bed. The guard outside nodded good night. As she reached her cabin door, she noticed the delicate color of the late evening sky, a lovely fragment seen through the hatchway. Dark was falling, but there would be lanterns on deck. It was not far. She climbed up, stepping into a velvet night unlike anything she had seen. To the west, the sun disappeared in banks of cloud tinged with rose, soft oranges, and delicate yellows. In the east, the moon hung low, her glow across the water lighting the waves. The sky above glittered with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Entranced, she walked to the rail. Suddenly, a sleek form broke the surface of the water. Arcing high and diving with a splash, she gasped in delight, clapping her hands together as another, then two at once, rose and dove. Miss Nicholson, is all well? Hugh had been standing alone, watching the moonrise. Hearing someone, he turned to see Nora, her hands clasped and face wrapped. She smiled warmly at him. See them, she asked. They're following the ship, I think. 3 dolphins broke the surface behind, and she turned back to the sea. Dolphins are lovely creatures, he said. Dolphins, she said. Is that what they are? I could watch them for hours. They bring good luck, he said, which is why our ship is named for one. Sailors love them. They can be quite friendly and have been known to save men from drowning by pushing them to the surface. Wonderful, she said, her eyes on the pod swimming alongside. May I escort you to your cabin, he asked. They are beautiful, but perhaps your brother will be concerned for you. She gave him an impish look. Edward is fast asleep, I am certain, Major Beaumont. How could I miss such a sight? He raised his eyebrows. Apparently, she was not completely under her brother's thumb. Was Nicholson aware his sister had this hidden independence, or did he slumber in ignorance? You're in the right, Miss Nicholson, he said. Certainly, dolphins in the moonlight are not to be missed. They're pulling ahead. Would you care to walk forward? He crooked his arm, and she rested her hand on his sleeve. They strolled across the deck, passing a few seamen who grinned genially at Hugh, sketched a bow to Nora, and went about their business. They reached the prow to find the dolphins riding the bow wave, arcing, diving, racing along with the ship. They are playing, she exclaimed. Indeed they are. He watched her profile as she watched the dolphins. She was lovely, he thought, in a classical style, straight nose, wide brows, clear eyes with a fringe of dark lashes, rounded cheeks, a determined chin. Here in the moonlight, imagining her dressed in one of the Grecian robes he'd seen in Paris after the war, she was the equal of any of the fine ladies he'd met there. Next morning, Nora woke to a feeling of quiet elation she couldn't place. Something about the moon. Oh yes, dolphins. And Major Beaumont. Her face burned. She had strolled around the deck in the moonlight, arm in arm with a man. Anyone could have seen them, and the deck crew certainly had. Last night, it didn't seem to matter, but this morning she felt... What did she feel? And there I will end.
That was absolutely lovely. And now, we will have a Q&A session. If anyone has any comments, please type a C. And if you have any questions, please type a Q, and I will get to you immediately. Yeah, I'm going to throw in a question while I'm waiting for everyone to throw in their Q's and C's. Do you plan to do your own audiobook?
Maybe. What happened for me in the writing is this. Wild at Heart is the first in a series. I had 2 other books planned also related to the dolphin. Some things intervened. including I mentioned that I have some chronic health issues, and I had some issues last year that slowed me down in a number of ways, and it hasn't happened. I mentioned how important the indie publishing world was to me, and particularly for genre works from a new author. The recommendation is not to do heavy marketing until you have at least 3 books out, because readers in this genre, as in other genres, don't want a singleton book. They want to know that they can go back to an author, assuming they find they enjoy the author, for more. So my plan was to just get this out for the experience, then write more, and then do more marketing. It has been suggested to me that doing an audiobook and doing it myself might be a good idea, and I would certainly consider that. Another part of that equation for me is, in order for that to be workable, I would need to make sure I had adequate equipment to get pro quality recording. So that would be another consideration for me. But thank you for the question.
I understand completely, and I am rather in the same boat equipment-wise. And next we have a question from Kiki. Go ahead.
Well, you actually answered my question. I saw that the book had a subtitle, an Explorers Club Romance, and so I was asking if you had additional books planned in the series, and you've let me know that you do. So that was the first question. How much? I'm also curious about how much research you had to do for this book. What percentage of your, in quotes, writing time was spent in research?
That's tricky to answer. I did quite a bit. I would also say that the English Regency and the Napoleonic period in general has been for many, many years a particular interest of mine. So I've read a lot of history from that era and have a number of books on my shelves that relate to that era. What I needed to do specifically for this book that proved actually more difficult than I thought is to get together details of the Age of Sail. So of course I leaned on the many wikis that have been developed around Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin novels, but it is oddly difficult to get specific answers to questions like, how long would it take a fifth rate to sail from London to China, which is its eventual destination, and where might they stop on the way? So there were various details that were, took me some digging to get an answer that seemed reasonable, but I already had a pretty good background in that time in history that I was able to lean on.
Sorry, my bad about the screaming there. I am having some slight flashbacks about my own research problems. Sorry, go ahead, Savage. Savage adds, I recently read Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, which gives a lot of information about sailing. My own research involved 17th century sailing from, say, from Holland, the Netherlands, to the East Coast. So that was fun. Do we have any more questions or comments? Throw in a C or a Q. All right, well then, if not, without further ado, we have a fun raffle. So I think we will just go alphabetically and start with Afa. And I do not have control of the bowl in this avatar. So Afa, if you would like to come on over to your board. Let's see. If I can get this thing to res for me. If you would like to click it and choose a winner.
Click on the bowl to bring up the menu. Is that, I've never done this kind of thing before.
Okay, I think you can click on either.
Okay, let me see what happens here.
Yes. Has anything happened? Draw will start. 9, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Da 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 da.
Yay!
Congratulations, Savage! You are the winner of Wild at Heart.
So, Savage and I are friends, actually. And so I will work out with him the best way to get him his copy.
All right. And I think it involves an email address.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure we can sort that out.
Kiki.
And Rennie had slipped in a question about language. And what I would say just very briefly is that I steered a course between keeping it accessible to the unfamiliar reader and adding in enough phrases here and there to keep the flavor of the time. Hopefully I did that successfully.
Kiki, come on up. Can you see me, Kiki? Ah, she is. Whoops. She has entered the drawing for herself. Oh dear. So I think you need to click it. Afa, if you could tell her which button you pressed to do the drawing.
I clicked the bowl, which brought up the menu, and then I clicked draw contest, and it gave me options from there.
Okay, so Kiki, if you're still here, can you try to click the bowl and draw a contest? Having some contest drama here. Ah, here we go. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I do believe you are going to need to draw again. Oh, contest status off? Do we know all who entered?
Okay, if everybody who entered will pick a number between 1 and 10. I will whisper the number into
chat.
I don't know what I will do. Into chat, into Nicole's chat. And I am so sorry. I was crashing just at the wrong moment.
All right, so did we have 3 or 4 contestant members? I think we had, there we go. We have everybody now. Oh, you kids, you rascally kids are just determined to cause all the trouble. Now I have to whisper. You kids are adorable. If it wasn't for you, my nefarious plan would have worked.
I am so sorry. You had this so beautifully organized, and it got, I was crashing and not myself at all.
Okay, under those circumstances, should we make...
Well, which number is closest?
But they both are. No, wait.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, let me... They said... Of mice and men, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I apparently don't have enough caffeine. Maya is our winner.
Yay, Maya!
And Maya, you need to trade your email address to Kiki.
And I will send you a Kindle version of my book to your email.
Congratulations! Yay!
Yeah. Okay. Nicole, will you get me send me her email address